Hello, Geography 232 students. Welcome to week 6 of our class. This week we're going to be talking about deep learning. It's under the overarching umbrella of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we're going to dive into that with a brief overview of deep learning, machine learning, and AI in general, and then how they apply to GIS specifically. So this week's lecture obviously is on deep learning. This week's lab is called Detect Swimming Pools with Deep Learning, and it's going to be an Esri provided lab once again. Upon completion of this lecture and lab, you should know how to differentiate between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning, identify and describe different deep learning GIS tools, and finally use deep learning tools to detect features on the landscape. Quick outline. We're going to do a quick refresher on classification. It's been a couple of weeks since we've done that. What is deep learning, machine learning, and deep learning in GIS? And finally, deep learning GIS tools. What are the actual tools that are available to you in GIS? So, quick refresher on classification. All right, what is image classification? So classification, it is a verb, it is an action, right? So it's the act or process of categorizing things according to shared qualities or characteristics. And as you know now, as we've been in the class for a couple of weeks, several weeks, that those qualities or characteristics can be related to spectral signature, like the color, the light that they reflect to the image sensor. They can also be a common shape or a proximity, right? So it's about reflectivity, proximity to other same features, or perhaps shape on the landscape. And I always like to use the example of animal classification. So from kingdom all the way down to species, as you drill down farther and farther, those subgroups get tighter and tighter and more specific, right? And so it's the same thing with classification. We might have a high level, like forest, for example, but within forest, we might be able to drill down even farther and say that forest includes deciduous trees, evergreen trees, maybe chaparral, things like that, right? So classification is based on shared characteristics, and as the specificity increases, groupings get smaller, right? So the broad land cover category gets down smaller and smaller with each different level. Image classification includes the processes and methods for converting imagery into map information. And once again, that's my mantra, said slightly differently here, that the point of GIS is to draw out actionable intelligence from raw data. Right? So we can do that in myriad ways. We can do that just with points, lines, and polygons. We can do that with raster data, right? But the goal is to take something that is in a raw format, run some sort of processing, whether it be a geoprocess or statistical analysis or spatial analysis of that sort, and learn something new from the data. That's always the goal, right? So it can be a manual process. Going back to week 1 and 2, talking about elements of image interpretation, right? It's the manual process of interpreting an image with your eye, looking at the shape and the size and the sameness of features, patterns, textures, colors, things like that, right? Or it can be an automated process, right? And so we've looked at supervised classification, unsupervised classification, and this week we're going to talk a little bit about object-based, right? So you'll find out about that in this week's lab. So with any method, the goal is to make sense of the pixels on screen, right? So you have raw data, pixels in a raster image. It's to make sense of it. It's to pull actionable intelligence from those pixels. So the methods rely on algorithms to translate and make sense of the pixel values. Remember, a pixel, it can be a representation of the reflectivity, the reflectance of the landscape. It's a spectral signature, or it could also be reflective of some other sensed value like elevation or temperature or ocean depth or something of that effect, right? So classification methods group data into classes with similar characteristics, for example, hue and texture or perhaps temperature, right? And algorithms are highly varied and range from simple rule sets of maybe yes-no binaries to something more sophisticated that rely on ordinary least squares or geographic weighted statistics, right? And so just be aware that there are different levels of complexity when it comes to these algorithms. And on the extreme end of complexity, we have these new and still developing machine learning methods. And that's what we're going to talk about this week. So machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. And within machine learning, we're going to talk about deep learning. So what is deep learning? As I said, Deep learning is a subset of machine learning, which is itself a subset of artificial intelligence. So I've got a great useful graphic there that you'll see floating around if you research this topic, and it's these concentric circles, right? So deep learning is housed under machine learning is housed under artificial intelligence, and AI is essentially the overarching umbrella that includes any sort of technology that emulates human intelligence. But you'll often find that the words are used interchangeably, but they all have a distinct meaning. So machine learning means computers that learn from data using algorithms to perform a task without being explicitly programmed. So there are different degrees of human involvement in each of these. Okay, so machine learning still involves a degree of human involvement, but every single step along the way doesn't have to be programmed. It can actually rely on some sort of algorithm to automate the process. Deep learning uses a very complex structure of algorithms modeled after the human brain, and you'll hear about essentially neural networks, right? So these are hidden layers within an algorithm that sort of simulate the interconnected network of our own brains. And there's no way to fully, at this point in history, to fully emulate the human brain. It's so complex. But these neural network deep learning algorithms have gotten very, very complex over the last decade or so. And they continue to increase in complexity and utility. And that's how we have things like self-driving cars. Like you can get in a Tesla now and flip a button on the steering wheel and literally your car will drive for you. Well, how does it do that? Through very complex deep learning algorithms that can identify on the fly quickly what is a car, what is a street light, and what is a human, a pedestrian, right? And so these are all based off very complex algorithms that learn and improve with time. In the context of GIS, in other data analysis, this enables the processing of unstructured data, such as documents, images, and text. Obviously, depending on the application, those data types will become more weighty, right? So that's more important that your Tesla doesn't crash into a person than your computer doesn't crash, right? So depending on the environment, the importance of the accuracy and the output of those algorithms will obviously depend on the environment and the utility. So let's start at the top. What is artificial intelligence? AI is a broad field of theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. And so this dates back to the 1940s and 50s. Maybe you've heard of Alan Turing and his famous Turing test. Well, it's based on a paper published in 1950. So AI goes back a long time. At this point, over 70 years, right? So after the Second World War. And obviously over that time, it's increased sort of exponentially in the last couple of decades as its utility has increased. So AI can be grouped into more or less two camps. We have weak AI and strong AI. Sometimes you hear a weak AI called a narrow AI, and strong AI as an AGI, artificial general intelligence, or maybe artificial superintelligence. So as the names imply, the weak or the narrow is narrowly focused. It's focused on a specific task. So in this case, GIS, it's weak AI, right? It's AI that's designed to accomplish a very specific and finite goal, which is, in our case, interpreting imagery, right? Contrast that with strong AI or artificial general intelligence, and that would be artificial intelligence or AI that emulates a human brain where regardless of the environment or the task, the algorithms can sort it out, can figure it out. And obviously AGI is a much loftier goal and outside the purview of this class. AGI mimics the general human intelligence, and there are like IBM's Watson, and there are a couple of examples like that out there that try to emulate a human brain, but even then, there's a long ways to go before they can actually emulate a human. So what's machine learning? Machine learning, as I said, it falls under the umbrella of AI. Machine learning is the general term for when computers learn from data. Okay. So at the intersection of computer science and statistics, where algorithms are used to perform a specific task without being explicitly programmed. Instead, the algorithms recognize patterns in the data and make predictions once new data arrives. And so it sounds fairly similar to deep learning, and you'll see that they are fairly similar. Deep learning just has less human involvement, essentially. So machine learning relies on the use of data and algorithms to imitate the way humans learn, gradually improving accuracy. Machine learning algorithms machine learning algorithms leverage structured, labeled data to make predictions. So that's the key thing: structured and labeled. These obviously imply some sort of human involvement there, and this pre-processing is key to organizing data into a structured format. So machine learning relies on pre-processed data that has had a human touch involved with it. And these specific features are defined and organized into classes. And how does that compare with deep learning? As I said, deep learning, it's very similar to machine learning, and in some ways they're the same. The key difference with deep learning is less reliance on human involvement, and also the structure of the algorithms, where they are inspired by the human brain, essentially. So deep learning eliminates some data pre-processing requirements. Deep learning algorithms can ingest and process unstructured data like text and images and automate feature extraction. And this removes some dependency on human experience. It does so with layered structure algorithms called an artificial neural network, or an ANN. And you can see the example here on the right. We have the input layer, we have hidden layers, and this is where we start to sort of see the model based off human neurons, right? Brain neurons, where one input can have multiple outputs, and then the resulting output from that can have multiple outputs. And so it becomes this web of potential pathways, and ultimately they lead to the output layer, which after the deep learning algorithm has been trained enough times, it has a fairly low margin of error. For example, imagine we want to categorize photos into cat or dog. On the right-hand side here, we have 7 photos of cats and dogs, and let's say the goal is to categorize them by species type. Deep learning algorithms can determine which features, for example, a cat's ears or a dog's ears, a cat's nose or a dog's nose, or a tail, are the most important to distinguish each animal from another. With machine learning, this hierarchy of features is established manually by a human expert. With deep learning, the hierarchy of features adjusts itself with each new iteration, increasing prediction accuracy with each new photo. All right, so the initial run through will say this is after 25 iterations of the algorithm. We can see that for the most part, the dogs have been classified into the dog category, the cats have been classified in the cat category, but we still have some margin of error. This little pug here on the lower left, maybe it's a loaf of bread. Movie reference. I won't explain it here. As the algorithm continues to improve itself through multiple iterations, we start to see that eventually that loaf of bread is actually identified as a dog, and the classification gets better and better. So deep learning algorithms adjust themselves for accuracy with each new iteration, allowing it to make predictions about a new photo of an animal with increased precision. So a cost function within the algorithm gauges accuracy with each iteration of updates. So the accuracy can actually essentially improve itself by comparing the results to the expected statistical analysis outcomes for the inputs. So once the function is close to or equal to 0, the model has reached the smallest possible error, and that's what we consider a fully trained model. So machine learning and deep learning in GIS. Machine learning has been a core component of spatial analysis in GIS for years. The term itself has come into vogue more recently, but machine learning as an actual geoprocessing tool has existed for 20 years or so. So the tools and algorithms have been applied to geoprocessing to solve problems in 3 broad categories: classification, clustering, and prediction algorithms. So classifications, like, for example, vector machine algorithms, which allow the creation of land cover classification layers. You've done this before already, right? So we used classification method with supervised training to essentially create a land cover classification. We've done it in a couple different contexts to determine like what's permeable versus impermeable, what are trees, what are not, right? Clustering, this is actually involves point data, where we can process large quantities of points to identify meaningful clusters. And these are tasks that are covered in the spatial analysis class in Geography 231. Hot zones and cold zones, hot spots, cold spots, And then finally, prediction algorithms, for example, geographically weighted regression, GWR, or ordinary least squares regression. These model spatially varying relationships and identify statistically significant attributes. And this is also covered in Geography 231. So these all fall into the category of machine learning because we're taking inputs with known variables, which you can consider the training samples, and we are training unknown variables, or essentially we are looking to interpret unknown variables to make sense of the data. So classification, clustering, and prediction algorithms are useful for deriving actionable intelligence from input data, but they need experts to identify or feed in those factors or features that affect the outcome of the model. We call these training samples in the context of raster analysis, known variables, or observed values, and those are more terms applied to statistical analysis. And deep learning can, in theory, carry out the same tasks without the need for human training through those multiple iterations and the improvement of the algorithms. So deep learning in GIS. The growth of deep learning in GIS can be attributed to three primary developments. One, increased availability of data. And I've talked about this in other contexts, but essentially over the last 20 years or so, the sheer volume of data has continued to increase to a point where we need better ways of processing it, right? So we now have vast quantities of data thanks to the internet, sensors all around us, cell phones, satellites, drones, etc., and numerous, obviously, remote sensing satellites like Landsats 1 through 9, the European Space Agency array, and so on and so forth. So greater volume, variety, and complexity. This is all so-called big data. You've probably heard the term big data before. That big data needs to be processed somehow, and not just with old traditional methods. Second factor is faster computing. We have powerful computational resources thanks to cloud computing and advanced graphical processing units like GPUs, and those allow us to take those large big data sets and translate them, and make sense of them, pull actionable intelligence from them. So more powerful than ever and cheaper than ever, thanks in part to the gaming industry, which is kind of interesting. And full disclosure, I actually do all my GIS stuff on a gaming laptop, but I'm not much of a gamer. I don't actually use it for games. But because it has a GPU and it's able to essentially run a complex spatial data with its separate independent GPU versus its CPU, it's actually a benefit using a gaming laptop. And those have come down in price apparently significantly. I don't remember what this was, but I've had it for a couple of years. And it used to be that you had to be willing to invest quite a bit of money for such a machine, but it's not the case anymore. And finally, algorithm improvements or algorithmic improvements. So AI algorithms have continued to improve over the last 20 years. GIS has benefited from gains in information technology industry. So GIS has sort of ridden this wave on the back of Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter and all these large big data companies. Essentially, some of these are, you've probably heard the term maybe data farms before. That's what Facebook and Twitter are. They're constantly collecting data and interpreting it, repackaging it, sometimes selling it, right? So it's all done through algorithms. And briefly, what is an algorithm? You have an input, you run it through a set of rules to obtain the expected output from a given input, and then you have your output value. So that's more or less an algorithm at its simplest. So deep learning GIS tools. Deep learning GIS tools can extract new information from imagery by detecting unique characteristics of features within an image. And you see 4 different examples here: image classification, object detection, semantic segmentation, and instance segmentation. And I'll briefly explain what each of these are. Image classification. You've had some sort of exposure to this in other contexts. Image classification involves assigning a label or class to a digital image. For instance, cat versus dog in my previous example, or in this case here, cat versus a dense crowd, 2 things that are completely unrelated. This type of classification is also known as object classification or image recognition, and it can be used in GIS to categorize features in an image. And it's quite useful when you're trying to identify what is permeable versus impermeable, what is maybe burned landscape versus non-burned landscape, or what is urban versus rural, right? So there are a lot of practical applications to this. Maybe you want to find out the damage from a hailstorm, right, on your crops. So there are a lot of different ways to classify imagery to make sense of them. Object detection. So object detection is the process of locating features in an image, for instance, IDing an airplane or multiple animals in an image, as the examples show below. This involves drawing a bounding box around the features of interest to say, here they are, right? And you're going to be doing this in this week's lab. So you actually have some experience with this. And it can be used in GIS to locate specific features in satellite, aerial, or drone imagery, and to plot those features on the map. Semantic segmentation. This is also similar to what we've done in the past as well, with obviously machine learning techniques, not deep learning. So this occurs when each pixel in an image is classified as belonging to a class. For example, road pixels are classified separately from non-road pixels, or separating a cat from other objects, like in the background and foreground. So we did this with our permeable versus impermeable lab. We're able to identify based off of spectral signature. And that's one way of doing it, but also there are ways of segmenting the landscape based off of shape, texture, and other elements. So this is referred to as pixel classification, image segmentation, or image classification. And finally, instance segmentation, which is image segmentation, but where we're able to draw a more precise boundary from one feature to the next. So it's a more precise object detection method in which the boundary of each object instance is drawn. For example, the rooftops of houses are detected, so one house is separate from another, including the precise outline of the roof shape or individual cars here. And you might wonder, maybe you don't wonder this, I think about this sort of thing. How do we come up with these building footprint layers? Like if you ever have looked at building footprints or maybe parcel data, how do we come up with that? Well, it's not a person hand digitizing each building footprint. It's actually through the instant segmentation of an aerial image. Through various AI techniques, we can actually delineate one building shape from another and then intuit out the building footprints through fairly quick automated processes. This type of deep learning application is also known as object segmentation. So how does this all work? This looks like a very overwhelming flowchart, but essentially we'll kind of try to break it down for you as best I can. So we start with what we call a training extent or of a preprocessed image. And that's just a finite area, a limited scope sample, if you will, of a larger full extent or full image. So like in this week's lab, for example, we use a training extent, which occupies maybe a third of the image or less, and then we apply it to the full image. Okay, so it's about essentially creating training sites, but instead of hand identifying what the shapes are, you just do a small selection. So we begin with labeling. So every feature has been essentially identified on screen with either points or polygons. And it can be done by hand or with a downloaded file. The data prep, which essentially takes little examples of where these real life features are intersected by the points or polygons. A training model is created. From that training model, objects are detected, and then a process of QA/QC. And that means quality assurance, quality checking. And essentially what that QA/QC process does is it narrows down the margin of error. And it does so through multiple iterations. And you can choose a number of iterations based off of your task. And so once one's done, it restarts it again, and it checks the output against essentially the control group, right? So it'll go back to where those points and polygons had identified. In this case, it looks like building rooftops or maybe pads. And so these are definitely locations or instances, and then it compares that against the output. And if it's too far off, it redoes the iteration one more time. Once the training model has been completed, we then apply that model to the full area, the full landscape. So we have the trained inference model, we plug it in to the full aerial image. It detects objects based off of the model's direction. Then you will review you'll run the QA/QC yourself, and you will then see how it did. And if it looks like it's accurate, you're good. If not, you rerun it again. And so it's a fairly straightforward process, and it takes out some of the human involvement that we've experienced in previous geoprocessing techniques. So in summary, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and deep learning are related but distinct theories and practices, and I think it's best to kind of visualize like this. Artificial intelligence includes machine learning and deep learning. Machine learning includes deep learning, or you can say deep learning is a subset of machine learning, and they're both subsets of artificial intelligence. Growth in data availability, increased computing power, and improved algorithms has facilitated the development of deep learning over the last several decades. And deep learning GIS tools extract new information from imagery by detecting unique characteristics within the landscape or the image. Okay, so before I sign off, I just want one note about this week's lab. The lab was written for a previous version of ArcGIS Pro, version 2.6. We're currently on 2.9. By the time you're seeing this video in the future, maybe 3.0 and beyond. So make sure that you click on the follow deep learning libraries link and download the version for 2.9, which is the existing version you'll find on the website, but the lab says 2.6. So just make sure you're downloading for version 2.9. Also be aware it's a large file. It's about 2.5 gigs. So make sure you have enough hard drive space and you're ready. You have time to download it and run all the various tools. The tools are time consuming. So make sure that you give yourself enough time this week for the data download and for the actual algorithm training as well, which takes quite some time. So on that note, have a great week. Reach out if you have questions. I'll talk to y'all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.